Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are joined by Dr. Zach Simmons, who is Editor-in-Chief of Muscle and Nerve from Penn State, and Dr. Peter Kang from the University of Minnesota. He is the Associate Editor of Muscle and Nerve. So we want to thank you all for joining, and I will turn the floor over to both of them. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna. And want to express my thanks to the AANEM for hosting this and giving Dr. Kang and I an opportunity today to talk to you about a topic which we hope you will find interesting and maybe generate some questions and further comments on your part. What we want to talk about is conducting peer reviews for a biomedical journal, and we'll be talking about it in a general sense, although some of the items we talk about will be directed more toward muscle and nerve. So we'll start with the first slide here. And let's see. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about how the workflow looks for papers that are submitted to our journal, Muscle and Nerve, so that people who are at this can understand how the process evolves. Can I have the next slide, please? So what happens is that all papers are submitted electronically to Muscle and Nerve, as they are to most journals, and they're checked by our editorial office for what I would call compliance. In other words, the initial submission guidelines that we have are very broad. We don't require that papers be specifically formatted the way they would be in a final paper, but they must comply with word limits. They need to meet authorship criteria, the specific formatting and other aspects are rather flexible, and these are all in our author guidelines for article types. Now, once the article is in an acceptable format, it is sent to the editor-in-chief. Next slide, please. And so after that, the editor-in-chief can make a decision, either summary rejection, which can occur for a variety of reasons, inappropriateness of content for the mission of the journal, for example, or is one of the most common. Another one, for example, would be that English quality is unacceptable and it has to be edited before it's resubmitted. Or another one would be that we've recently published a great deal on this and the article doesn't seem to contain any new content. Or the editor-in-chief may have discussion with one or more of the associate editors and make a decision about whether it should be sent for peer review or rejected. And then lastly, if it passes those initial reviews, it's assigned to either an associate editor or I assign it to myself, and then it's sent for peer review, which takes us to the topic of today's talk, which is, of course, peer review. So I'll let Dr. Kang take it from here.
Thanks, Dr. Simmons. And so we'll be going back and forth with various slides. And so I'll discuss the next few. So at this point, if it's assigned and selected for peer review, then it goes out to several reviewers. And so you get an invitation and you accept it, and then you get an automated email back saying, "Dear blank, thank you for accepting this review request. Please log on for access to the manuscript. I'd be grateful if you could submit your comments by the day before yesterday. Best regards, Editor-in-Chief." And that was just added for a little bit of humor because the deadlines always loom very quickly. I often agree to review something that says 2 or 3 weeks, and then before I know it, it's due the next day. So that's where the process starts. Now, what do you do? One of the key things that I think a reviewer should figure out at the beginning of this process is to come up with a system to take notes. And for those who are experienced reviewers, you already have a system in place in all likelihood. But if you're doing this for the first time, you may want to experiment with 1 or 2 different ways of doing things. So there are 3 options that come to mind immediately, and obviously there can be others, but these are 3 that I can think of. One is print out a copy of the manuscript and mark it up as you read it. 2 is read the manuscript on a screen and take notes on a separate document on your computer. And for doing this, it helps to have 2 screens. And then number 3 if you really want to go through it quickly, you can read the manuscript on a screen and then write your review simultaneously. This does take a little bit of experience, and it also helps to have two screens for this option. I personally tend to use option number 1 for new submissions and option number 3 for revisions, but everybody's a little bit different, and I've seen different styles in terms of reviews. Step 2, read the entire manuscript thoroughly. And you want to take a close look at the figures and tables, including the figure legends and footnotes. Don't forget the supplemental materials, if any. And I realize that that's sometimes a large amount of material, and we do appreciate all the work that the reviewers put into scrutinizing these manuscripts. So I always ask myself questions when I'm looking through a manuscript, and sometimes I overlook the title and I have to go back and take a look at it, but that's something that's sometimes easy to overlook. And so don't forget to look at the title. There are occasionally times when I think a manuscript's great, and then I look at the title and I think that doesn't quite match what the manuscript is saying. So you want to take a look at that. You also want to look at the abstract. You want the abstract to have key details as well as the big picture of what's going on overall. One tip is that a good abstract contains some key numbers and findings and avoids unnecessary vagueness. So you don't want to have an abstract that has no numbers, no results, or anything like that. You also don't want an abstract that's just a recitation of all of the findings, because that's a little bit too dense and you lose sight of the big picture. What about when you're reading the introduction? You want to ask, what question is the manuscript asking? The manuscript should be asking a question, and then is the question important to the field? And what is the background in terms of the other literature? Has it already been answered in prior work? The introduction should be relatively succinct, ideally about a single double-spaced page plus or minus, and this isn't rigid or anything like that, but a single double-spaced page for a lot of manuscripts is enough to answer these questions. And what sometimes is a problem is if the introduction goes on for 2 or even 3 pages and ends up being a mini review of all the literature. And so sometimes some of that material belongs in the discussion, sometimes it's not necessary, and it helps to make a note of that. How about the methods? You want to ask what methods are being used to answer the question, and are these methods appropriate to the question? And then you want to ask about are IRB protocols mentioned, or in other countries are sometimes called ethics committees. And then IACUC refers to animal experiments. Muscle and Nerve does publish some animal studies, so we do want in specific cases to see IACUC approvals. We do not need to see protocol numbers. That's typically not something that's needed, but it does help to know what institutions the protocols were approved at. And then, if relevant, are the statistical approaches explained adequately? The methods section should provide enough detail that theoretically, if you have another investigator who has the same data sets, that individual and their team should be able to replicate the results. How about the results section itself? You want to ask how rigorous and compelling are the results? Ideally, p-values for key findings should be significantly below 0.05. You want to look at results where the p-values are right on the border, and you want to make sure that they're being interpreted appropriately to what they are. Graphs should be visually compelling regardless of the p-value. If you have a p-value that's really, really small, 0.001, and yet you look at the graphs and it seems like things are overlapping and you don't see a difference between the two groups, that's something that should raise some questions. And you do want to ask, are the figures and tables easily digestible? Can the figures and tables tell at least part of the story independently of the text? And then you do want to make sure that the results are avoiding exact repetition of material in the figures and tables. For example, you don't want the results section to just replicate everything that's in the table, including all the p-values. That doesn't make for easy reading. Ideally, the results section should be summarizing the findings and pointing out details for a few of the key findings. And then the discussion. Does the discussion place the results in the context of the broader field and explain how the study represents an advance? Ideally, there'd be minimal summation of the results and maximum discussion of context. In many, though not all cases, the discussion should include a paragraph of limitations. And then at the very end, when you typically see a concluding paragraph, are the conclusions appropriate for the results? And then there are general questions that you want to ask as you're looking through this. Do you have any concerns about scientific integrity? Do you see any concerning conflicts of interest? Do you think that this manuscript will help other clinicians and or scientists in their own work? And do you think that this manuscript would be cited? And so I'll hand this back to Dr. Simmons for the next section.
Great. Thank you very much. So what I want to do here is to just talk a little bit about, as I look at the various sections, you've heard Dr. Kang's take on things, and we've learned working together that our approaches to looking at papers are very similar, at least I think. But there are ways that I look at it that that I express it here that may put a slightly different spin on it, and perhaps you'll find it to be helpful. So I want to look at it from an operational point of view. So as a reviewer, consider the following. Ideally, what should the various sections of a research article look like? And these would be things that you would think about if you were writing the article, but then when you're reviewing it, one should think about it the same sort of way. So let's go to the next slide. And then, so looking at the title, it should be clear and it should be concise, and it should succinctly summarize the core content and, if possible, the findings. So one thing would be avoid the obvious. If someone is submitting a letter to the editor, which is the form in which we accept case reports, it's not necessary to say a case report and a review of the literature. We know that because of the format in which you're submitting it. On the other hand, avoid a really prolonged summary of all the content. We really don't need a title that would say, for example, an assessment of the role of nerve conduction studies in the evaluation of demyelinating versus axonal polyneuropathies in patients presenting to a neuromuscular clinic at a tertiary care center with acute onset distal weakness and sensory loss. I mean, when we see a title like this, all I'm thinking is that really readers are not going to want to look at that. They really want to know succinctly what is the article about. Next slide, please. So then there's the abstract, and the abstract has 4 sections. They're labeled slightly differently in different journals, but basically they have the same organizational content. There's an introduction, and that should really be 2 parts: a brief background statement, which should describe the gap in the literature, why is your study needed, and then a succinct statement of aim. And as a reviewer, that's what you should look for. If it doesn't give brief background and it doesn't state the aim clearly, there's something lacking in that section of the abstract. The method should be very clear as well. It should have the core inclusion and exclusion criteria and brief statistical methods. If those are missing, the author needs to be told that. Next, looking at the results, as Dr. Kang mentioned, please make sure that the author is not simply repeating the methods, and that the abstract is stating succinctly the most important results. But there does need to be some quantitative or statistical data. An abstract that is strictly descriptive will really not convey the message as strongly as it should, and that's something to look for as you're reviewing an article. And lastly, when you look at the discussion should not repeat the results. So the discussion should place the core results in the context of the literature and in the context of clinical practice. But if all the discussion does is provide a summary of the results, then really think about asking the author to reframe the discussion in order to place it in a broader context. Okay, next slide, please. So then when looking at the main paper, what to look for. So looking at the introduction really should be geared toward the level and expertise of the readership. So if one is submitting to a journal which is a subspecialty journal such as Muscle and Nerve, it should include only the background information that's essential for the audience and for the content of the paper. A very basic description that says something along the lines of electrodiagnostic studies are one of the key methods that we use to evaluate peripheral nerve disorders is really not needed for a journal like Muscle and Nerve. The readers know that. So spend your time, so the author should spend their time really giving information that's critical to understanding the purpose their research. What's the gap in knowledge the study is trying to address, and why is the study needed? If it doesn't do that, help educate the writer that that's really what they need to do. And they should be ending with a succinct statement of their aim. Looking at the next section, the methods, what the author should do is define the type of study. And if they don't do that, then as a reviewer, it is part of your responsibility to make sure that the author does. Is the study prospective or is it retrospective? Is it blinded or placebo controlled? Is it open label? Is it case control? I've noted a number of articles that have been submitted to our journal. And one of the comments of the reviewer back to the author is, I couldn't tell from reading your paper whether your study was prospective or retrospective. It's very important that a reviewer tell the author if they can't determine that, because if they can't determine that, then they can't judge the quality of the study, and the readers will not be able to judge the quality of the study. The methods also need to define the patient population. And if appropriate, the control populations. What is the method of recruitment? What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? If those are not explicitly stated, really the reviewer needs to ask the author to do so. And then the author needs to clearly explain the study procedures. And usually most authors are very good about doing that in the methods. And then there needs to be, as Dr. Kang said, a statement of IRB or ethics committee review, and if needed, if it's a prospective study, a statement of informed consent. If you don't see those, please ask the author to put those in. A statistical analysis, of course, must be appropriate to the study question. So let's go on to the results. And the results, it's very important that in clinical research, the very beginning of the results section describe the study population. Many papers come into Muscle and Nerve, and what good reviewers will say as they're looking at it, if it doesn't say so, it will say, I couldn't tell anything about your study population. I didn't know their degree of disability. I didn't know their ages. I didn't know their duration of disease. If the study population is not defined, please ask the author to do so. That should be followed by a very clear description of the results, not by discussion points, but by results points. So the author should not be repeating the methods in the results, and they should not be bringing in the discussion into the results. The results should be just that. What did they find? But the data presentation needs to be limited in such a way that it addresses the aims of the study. Readers don't need to see every piece of data collected. And it's okay as a reviewer to tell an author that they're presenting too much data. It's also okay as a reviewer to tell the author that they're presenting too little data. Now, right, so how do you know if there's too much or too little? There should be, that's a judgment call, and that's the reviewer's judgment call, but there should be enough that one understands what the author did, but it doesn't have to be every piece of data they collected. Then looking at more aspects of the results, electrodiagnostic data, at least in Muscle and Nerve, should be presented in some detail. It's not very helpful for our readers to see a statement that says something along the lines of, nerve conduction studies and needle examination revealed an acquired demyelinating polyneuropathy. Why? Because the readers need to be convinced of that, because this is a core interest of people who read this journal. So those should be provided in detail. Statistically significant differences should be summarized. If an author starts talking about trends and tendencies, please call that out. It's a bit of sloppy reporting, and it does tend to inadvertently confuse readers to hear a statement such as A was greater than B, but this was not statistically significant, it was a trend. Well, you're doing statistical analysis so that you can tell if something was statistically significant. So it's better for authors to be very clear-cut about it, and it's okay for reviewers to call that out. And finally, it's also important as a reviewer to, as Dr. Kang said, make sure that the results are not redundant with the tables and the figures. The results should highlight key points, descriptive language. The tables and figures can have more specific data. So let's go on lastly to the discussion. So the discussion should begin with a succinct statement of key findings, but in general, the discussion needs to avoid repeating the results. So one doesn't want to see the results repeated, and then a few lines of discussion, results repeated again, a few lines of discussion. The reader has already read the results. Just start discussing why your findings are meaningful or important. Provide a, place these findings in the context of the literature and of clinical practice, and then provide a limitations section. What are the limitations of your study? All studies have limitations. And then a very, very succinct conclusion. When I was early in my training, a very senior editor of a major journal once said to me, don't repeat your methods in your results, and don't repeat your results in your discussion. And I thought that that was really, really good advice. Say everything once, and but say it clearly. Okay. Lastly, just tables and figures. So tables should provide succinct summaries of data. They shouldn't be redundant with results, as I said, but very detailed tables should be supplementary. Tables in manuscript should be succinct. They should be summary tables that generally can be printed on a single journal page. If it's longer than that, put it as supplemental. With regard to figures, the figures are useful only when they enhance the data presentation or they allow important concepts to be visualized. They again shouldn't be redundant with your results or with your tables. And figures, if previously published, can even if they're in one of your papers, can only be used or adapted with permission of the publisher unless you own the rights to those figures or tables. Okay. All right, I think we will switch back now to Dr. Kang.
Thank you. So after going through the manuscript, taking your notes, it's now time for step 3, composing and submitting your review. So the most important rule is to be candid but respectful. You want your comments to help the authors, but you also don't want to demoralize them by being too harsh. So it is a fine line, and I think experienced reviewers are very good at walking that line and giving people the feedback they need, but yet showing them the path to improve their manuscript. You should always assume that the editors will be asking for a revision and provide helpful tips on how the manuscript can be improved. Even if the manuscript's rejected, hopefully the authors will benefit from the advice and revise and submit elsewhere. Some reviewers tend to list all their comments by number or bullet point, kind of one after the other. Others divide their comments into 2 sections, major versus minor comments, and there's no right way to do this. And so as long as they're somewhat easy to sort through, that's the main point. If there are numerous grammatical errors or other things like that that keep recurring throughout the manuscript, I would just comment on the general need for proofreading or English language editing. There's no need to correct every error. We don't want the reviewers to be spending a lot of time proofreading. That's not really what we're looking for. And so yeah, we do want the reviewers to focus on the major issues as much as possible. Most journals do ask, and Muscle and Nerve is one of them, most journals ask for categorical or numerical ratings of manuscripts in addition to the narrative comments, and these can often include suggested decisions, accept, minor revision, major revision, reject, or some variation on these choices. Major revision typically means that they do go back to the reviewers to be looked at again. Minor revision typically means that the editorial team, the editor-in-chief, and often the associate editor will be looking at it without sending it back to the reviewers. As much as possible, try to ensure that these ratings correspond with your narrative comments. It sometimes gets confusing if we see a lot of really positive comments, but then a really negative rating or vice versa. There is typically a section, and Muscle and Nerve does this also, where you can enter confidential comments to the editor. Topics that are appropriate for such communications, if you have concerns about plagiarism or other ethical concerns, concerns about conflicts of interest. If there's other things that you want to discuss with the editor, such as you're not really sure if this should be a minor revision or a major revision, that's often something that people think about. This is a spot where you can convey this to the editor and gives that editor some context. So these are a few sample reviews, and these are fictional. So you don't want to write a review like this. This is the best manuscript I've read in 20 years, sure to be a landmark in our field. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So even if the manuscript is amazing, it's helpful to have a few more details than this. At the other extreme, there's sample review number 2. This manuscript is awful. I fell asleep twice while reading it. Please spare the medical world from being exposed to this one. So this review is not helpful to the authors because if there's a problem with the manuscript, they don't really know how to fix it. So sample review number 3, oftentimes it's helpful to have at least a brief summary of what the manuscript is about at the beginning, and then lead into comments. And so if you divide your comments up into major and minor, these are examples of major comments. For a neuroimmunological disease paper, it's not clear if the antibody titers are measured in a research lab or clinical lab. Please clarify and talk about IRB protocols. And then major comments can also include concerns about statistical analyses. You don't see sensitivities and positive predictive values when they should be there. And then minor comments will be things like, well, the labels on the graphs are hard to read. They need to be bigger. You don't see scale bars in a histological image, and you really do need scale bars. So things like that. And as you become more experienced, you'll have a sense of what counts as major versus minor comments. After you review, the editor will render a final decision, and often you'll get blind copied on the decision letter. It's often helpful to read the other reviews to see how much you line up with the other reviews, especially if you're new to it. If a revision is requested, you will often be asked to re-review, and you might be seeing this again. So re-reviews, this is an opportunity to see the new and improved manuscript. The author's response document is an excellent guide to the revision, and I rely on that document heavily. When available, a track changes version of the revision is really helpful to me so that I can see what's been changed. In most cases, authors will be pretty agreeable, go along with your suggestions, revise accordingly. In rare cases, authors will rebut one or more of your points as a reviewer. So there are cases when maybe you missed something, you thought something was missing from the manuscript, but it's actually there, and the authors gently point that out. In that case, it's probably best to let that go. If the rebuttal is due to the authors not understanding your original point, you should try to clarify your point and explain why it was so important. Once in a while, we do run into a rebuttal that's due to obstinacy or even sometimes unprofessional attitudes. Then it is justified to reinforce your original points and be insistent. And in a case like that, certainly feel free to stand your ground. In rare cases where the authors clearly refuse to heed reasonable guidance or fail to address major concerns, the manuscript may be rejected at the revision stage. So there's no guarantee during revision that a manuscript will be accepted. That is the usual outcome, but it's not guaranteed. So what are the rewards of reviewing? It's an opportunity to see exciting research before it's published, though manuscript contents must be kept confidential, and that is really important. This is an excellent way to hone critical reading and thinking skills. And for me, seeing a manuscript in the pre-published form makes me feel that I can look at it more critically, and that has helped me read the literature more critically. Ad hoc reviewing is an activity that's eligible to be included on CVs and promotion packets in the United States for academic institutions. So in some cases, repeated high-quality reviews may catch the attention of the editors and lead to an invitation to join an editorial board. So how do I join an editorial board? The appointment process differs for each journal. In most cases, the editor-in-chief has the final say on appointments. Some journals have a formal application process, others don't. It depends on the journal. It often takes a while to be appointed to an editorial board. And I have to say from my own experience, after I finished my training, I did ad hoc reviewing for a decade before I got invited to my first editorial board. So don't get discouraged if you are interested in that type of role in the future. Just be persistent, keep reviewing, and hopefully something turns out well in the end. So let me see, this is for Dr. Simmons again. Let me switch back to him.
Okay, great. So thanks. So just a few final points to sum up, and then be happy to answer questions if people have them. So all of us realize that peer reviewing is a time-consuming task, and although there are many advantages of it, as Dr. Kang pointed out, it takes time. We don't get you don't get compensated monetarily for it. It often involves a brief review of some background material or of papers cited in the submission, particularly when people do exceptionally good reviews, and we realize that. It's really a key to maintain a high level of professionalism and to be respectful, to avoid condescending or insulting comments. I certainly, if reviewers, as they do on very rare occasions, put in comments that sound very condescending or insulting, I simply remove those comments and I send the reviewer a letter that I let them know that I'm not forwarding those comments to the author. Remember that nobody sets out, and I was once told this by an author, I think this is great advice. Nobody sets out to perform a poor study or to write a low quality paper. If they are submitting it, it is the view of that author that they're submitting a reasonable research paper, and so they deserve that level of respect in return. Use the review as an opportunity to educate. Muscle and Nerve offers CME for peer reviewing, as do many other journals, so there is that small amount of compensation. And just a couple more final points. Let's see. Should you accept or decline an invitation to review when you get it? Well, you want to strike a balance. When you are invited by a high visibility journal or those that are clearly within your field of interest and expertise, you really should very strongly consider accepting those invitations, because they will be synchronous with your career goals and can enhance your academic career and your reputation and your visibility within the field. On the other hand, really think twice about invitations to review from very minor, low visibility journals. And I'm not specifically picking on any one journal, but at all. But I will say that there have been a proliferation of journals over the last decade and a half, and one could spend all of one's time doing peer reviews. Think about not only how much this will benefit the author, but how much will it benefit you? You only have so much time. And don't agree to so many reviews, even from journals that are important to you, that you can't meet deadlines. Editors will judge both the quality and the timeliness of your reviews. So with that in mind, those are really, let's see, the last things I wanted to do, except for one final point. And that is, how does one learn to write a review other than, sitting through a webinar like this is helpful, but we all learn by doing. It is acceptable for trainees or junior faculty, with permission of the primary reviewer, to draft the review and then give it to the primary reviewer to edit, discuss, and submit. And that reviewer, of course, should indicate to the editor that when submitting the review that they were assisted in this by this other doctor who they should name. But it is certainly very legitimate to speak with one of your mentors and to say to them, I'd really like to get some additional experience reviewing journal articles. The next time you're invited to review, do you mind if I try to draft the review for that? And then and almost all senior reviewers will agree to something like that. And usually they then tell me or the associate editor that this review was written by my trainee, Dr. X, and then reviewed by me, and I agree with its content. It's also perfectly acceptable, at least to ask this editor, whether your review was of acceptable quality. And I don't want to speak for all my associate editors, but it would be surprising to me if they wouldn't agree, if they wouldn't respond positively to something like that as well. We all learn from people who've done this more than we have, and I learn every day by reading reviews that other people do and by speaking to my associate editors. So if you write a review and you're not sure if it's really hit the mark, ask us. We can absolutely provide feedback. So those are my points. So Dr. Kang, or I want to really thank Dr. Kang so much for agreeing to do this today. And I think either of us are happy to take questions.
I think I see. Okay, I'll go in order. I see the first question. Can you go through what is needed to submit an editorial letter? I think that's a letter to the editor is what I suspect. Dr. Simmons, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so a letter to the editor, it can be really one of two things. It can be a case report, or it can be a response to a previous article that we've published. If it is a case report, there are very specific guidelines for the length of it. I will tell you that that our journal, like many, accepts only a very small number of case reports because it is challenging to identify cases which are unique enough that they serve a broad educational purpose and a broad discovery purpose for a subspecialty audience. But if you do think that a case is really unique enough that a subspecialty audience would benefit by reading it, then a succinct presentation of the case is worthwhile. There's no invitation required, but just be prepared that it is difficult to get a case report accepted unless it truly does present something which is which has either not been seen before or is so uncommon that it's rarely seen. I think you're muted, Dr.
So, thank you. I'll go through. I think I'll just read the questions if that sounds okay. And the second one is how to know which journal is low visibility. How can we tell what journals to maybe not be so eager to review for? Any thoughts?
Yeah. So if you go online, most major medical center libraries have ways to identify the credibility, so to speak, of journals. If you simply use a search engine and ask something like, how do I identify credible academic journals or something like that, there are some excellent guidelines put out by library associations that talk about that. And they often emphasize the quality of the individuals on the editorial board, the quality of the editor of the journal, the impact factor of the journal, which is a reflection of how often articles are cited, and then other things such as the percentage of submissions that they accept. So there are a number of different guidelines. None of them are absolute. And it is important also to realize when you are going to submit an article that you don't always have to submit to the journal with the highest impact factor that is the highest cited. General journals have far higher impact factors than specialty journals, and specialty journals have far higher impact factors than subspecialty journals. So it's always, no matter how good a subspecialty journal is, it will never have the impact factor of Lancet or Nature or the New England Journal. It just can't, because it doesn't appeal to as broad an audience. So choose a journal that is tailored to your audience, and then within that, try to look for journals that have the most credibility. You may have other thoughts, Dr. Kang. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's tricky because you can use numerical values like impact factors to some extent, but they don't really tell the full story. And one indication is what journals publish the kind of articles that you like to read and that you find helpful. But yeah, there's no one single good answer. I think it's a mixture of several factors. There is another question. Thank you. This was very helpful. Where I have the greatest challenge is in the literature cited. To what extent are we as reviewers responsible for assuring that all the citations within a document are appropriate for the content and information indicated? That is, do we need to check that every citation makes the point that the authors want to make?
Do you want to take that one first, Dr. Kang?
Sure. I think it's really difficult if you're looking at a research article that has 60 citations to go and check every one. So we don't expect you to check every citation. And I think there are some, especially if it's within your field of expertise, where you may know some of the key articles and you can tell right away, are they citing the articles? For example, because I study genetics of muscular dystrophy, I know from heart the article that described the first discovery of dystrophin as the Duchenne gene. And so I do think that it's important to be cited if someone's talking about the gene that causes Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So there are certain citations you'll know off the top of your head that are appropriate to cite. And then sometimes you'll see a citation for a review article, and that's totally fine if you're addressing general aspects of a condition, especially in the introduction. One thing that I try to do is sometimes I scan through the titles of a lot of the citations and see if at least the titles seem to make sense. Sometimes I notice one thing that is important and helpful is sometimes you see some references that are truncated. I've seen ones where sometimes there's just an author's name and then nothing else, or something else that happened that's gone awry. And that's typically an innocent error by the authors. And so you can point that out, especially if it's an isolated one. But then if I start to see that somehow the citation numbers and the titles don't really seem to match up, like, there's a citation for methods for an immunology assay, but then the article is about clinical aspects of a disease that doesn't seem to quite make sense. So then I dig a little bit further. So I'd say use your judgment, try to at least scan through the list and see if it makes sense. And then kind of dig a little deeper if you see anything that looks like a discrepancy. Dr. Simmons, you want to add anything?
No, I think that was a really, really good summary. Some reviewers are much more thorough about that than others. I think that it depends to some degree on what the focus of your review of that particular article is. For example, if the article in general has a large number of weaknesses in methodology and in results reporting and in contextual references with just contextual discussion in the discussion section, then the accuracy of the references becomes somewhat of a secondary point. On the other hand, if the references themselves if the article itself is really very high quality, then the references become a much more critical piece. And then I think Dr. Kang's recommendations are spot on.
Thank you. And a few more, and then I think we still have time if anyone wants to hang on to answer the last few questions. How can someone become a reviewer of muscle and nerve is the next question.
So, the best way, if you have an interest, would be to just email me. I will say that the number of people that email us who request to review is beyond the number that we are able to distribute articles to for review. It's important that people who send me a request have a reasonable publication record, so that we understand that when they review an article, it will be coming from the perspective of an individual who's been a successful author. I think if that individual has not yet had an opportunity to be a successful author, it's really better to work on authorship first and then work on reviewing as a secondary thing. And it is also important. I would also recommend that it would be good for anybody who's asked me about that opportunity for them to have perhaps worked with a more senior faculty member in doing some reviews, if they've not done a number on their own already, just so that other faculty member can be a reference for them. If I say, is there somebody you've worked with who could sort of vouch for what the quality of what you do with regard to reviews, that would be helpful as well. Because remember, when we send out for peer review, we're only sending it out generally to 2 or 3 peer reviewers for each article. So each review that we receive carries a great deal of weight. And so we really want to make sure that we can work very closly and collaboratively with you as a reviewer. So I would say that, write to me if you're interested. My email is in the journal, and let me know your perspective, what your background and experience are, and we can have a discussion.
Great. And I think let's do one final question. This one says, I often find that I spend time during my reviews trying to distinguish between the internal thoughts. Is this a bad point, or is it that they're poorly represented? Any comments on how to help with this? This is a tricky one, I think. So.
It is. I think in talking about a bad point or poorly represented, then so I guess it all comes back to the data, right? So one, if an individual has written a paper and they presented some data, the question is, can you look at their methods, determine how they've what method they've used to analyze that data, and based on that analysis, do you believe the data that they're presenting? I think that if you find their methods to be flawed, that's a cause for concern, and it's okay to call out an author on their methodology. Maybe their methodology is excellent, but they haven't explained it well. So you give them an opportunity to do so in the response. If you can't draw the same conclusion that they did, I think it's certainly worth explaining why that is and letting the author explain. I think that a lot of times we struggle with that. You know, and again, sometimes it's simply that the author's done a terrific job, but they simply haven't explained their methodology or how they got to that point, and you're giving them an opportunity to explain it. Other times, it just seems that what they're saying is wrong, and perhaps it is. Respectfully telling them why you're questioning that point should lead to them either being able to explain it or to say that, you know, that they've made an error. Those would be my thoughts, Dr. Kang, but unless you had something else as well, perhaps.
Oh, I agree completely. And one thing that I do sometimes is I try to compare what I see in the text with what's in the figures and tables. Sometimes I get confused by what I read in the results, and I ask a similar question. And then I go to the figures and I realize, oh, this is a really interesting point. They just need to explain it a little bit more clearly. And so then that's how sometimes I can get through that kind of issue. So I think this is a good point at which to wrap up. And yeah, I think this has been a good discussion and some really good questions that were asked.
Yeah, I would agree. So I'd like to thank Anna and the AANEM very much for allowing Dr. Kang and I to do this.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you everyone for joining.
Okay.